Now, Lazaris talks about the racket of the ego, that, how boring it is to listen to other people's stories. And I disagree with Lazaris on both emphasis and effectiveness, meaning there may be, and I'm sure there are, some Lazaris friends, etc., just as there are people in the larger world, a small percentage of people who have gotten over their stories. Byron Katie is doing a lot of work along those lines. Eckhart Tolle is doing a lot of work along those lines. Just about every age has a voice for transcending the personal story. And perhaps 1% of the population succeeds in that endeavor. I just listened to a 4-hour excerpts on the great work with Lazaris, and so he's kind of poking fun at that stage of needing to tell our stories and nobody wanting to hear them anymore, and that's that we have to go from that story of blaming our parents and all of that to the next story, which is the story of the self. And I would say, first of all, for my, in my journey, working with Lazaris since the age of 12, I did not do enough of a job understanding the pain of the ego, and seemed to have bypassed that in a destructive way. And so one of my criticisms of Lazaris is that there are various junctures in the material where there's a de-emphasis of something and an overemphasis or an emphasis on something else that doesn't always serve. And if you think of a ball moving forward, and you think of life as an inevitable ball moving forward, there's no point on the ball that's better or worse than any other point, but the point to emphasize and put weight on is the next point. If you're trying to roll forward, you want to emphasize the next step. And if you put weight on that, the ball, and keep doing that, you will succeed. But you also have to de-weight. You have to take weight off of, which means first getting in touch with and deprogramming the last bit. That's how momentum is created. And life has been doing a brilliant job. Ever since the universe began, life has been getting bigger, longer, more complex, more beautiful, right? More, the possibility field is expanding in all directions, positively and negatively, however we define that. But life is doing a tremendous job of growing, right? Of learning, of exploring. So life is doing a terrific job of that. And in our personal evolution, can we go forward? What's that balance point between not doing something and getting stuck there because we didn't do it and hanging on and going around, right? And I found, in the last, basically by doing too much dissociative burying that I didn't know that I was doing, because Lazaris doesn't talk about trauma and PTSD, or at least not in the time that I worked with Lazaris for more than probably 3,000 hours. There was no awareness of the biology of PTSD and dissociation. So I was already in a dissociative state by the time I encountered Lazaris by age 12, and not in touch with the body containing all of that trauma. And here's Lazaris saying, let go of the past and all that. I wasn't even in touch with the present, right? And so that bypass of all that material, first of all, creates a blind spot. And so I re-traumatized myself with sexual, psychedelic, therapeutic abuse. In other words, I hired someone to reenact my childhood abuse cycle unconsciously. And, a very dumb or a very brilliant, depending on how you want to look at it, therapist broke every law in the book, escalated a sexual relationship, turned it into a prostitution. So I was basically hiring my therapist to abuse me. And that broke the seal, right? Re-traumatization at a fragility state. Psychedelics escalate patterns of energy, increase vulnerability. So it basically put me into an infantile state so that, relatively speaking, my therapist became, as a father, the way I had actually been as an infant. So I redid the trauma because I had successfully bypassed it with the Lazaris material and other work, etc. And it just completely broke me. I couldn't function. I couldn't get off the floor. I found myself, for the first time in my life, filled with hate and rage and, just tremendous amounts of frozen energy. And, I didn't know where it was going to end because you couldn't work I couldn't work and make money in that state. And I was surrounded by incompetence, the same way, that most of our infants experience today as they're born into our modern world that is incredibly out of touch with what it's like to be an infant surrounded by giants. And so I watched the destructive cycle, this time consciously. I watched the collusion, I watched the corruption, I watched how other therapists protected, the therapist that sexually abused me. I watched the retaliation of truth-telling because I was cut off from my community for telling the truth about a community leader, right? That's what we do with Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, right? We cut off those that reveal the shadow in the cult. And so I got to relive as a 40-year-old the horror of my infancy with the mental mind to grasp what was happening, the magnitude of it, the scale of it. And it was, absolutely mind-fucking and heartbreaking. And it was too much to deal with, right? So I had to find addictions, right? How to, so I began eating. How much can I eat before I can tolerate thinking, right? And it was a lot, right? What do I have to do before I can fall asleep, right? And so this, this was after shadow work that was done in a dissociative state. This was after, healing my inner child for hundreds and hundreds of hours. That actually was the one thing it seemed to actually click, right? That I give high marks to Lazaris for that, arena because it actually worked. I felt reality shifting in response to healing my inner child and healing my adolescent. As an adolescent, when I was 16, I was healing the inner child and healing the inner adolescent. That was shifting, right? But a lot of this just dissociative. And so, it's just in the head. And Lazaris is brilliant at keeping things in the head by doing very little. Lazaris doesn't massage people. He doesn't, do jumping. He doesn't talk about embodiment. He doesn't lead somatic work. He doesn't do much engagement. A Lazaris event is a 99% Lazaris talking event at the speed that Lazaris likes to talk about things that in many ways. Like they don't connect with where people's bodies are at the time. And so for me, it was actually going into that story. What is it like to be an ego formed in that family system? What's it like to have a godmother and kindergarten teacher send me down into the cellar and say that I'll be eaten by witches because I'm fidgeting because I'm so traumatized? What's that like? How does a 5-year-old deal with that, right? How does a 5-year-old deal with being dragged around the house in a sack by a father that feels so powerless he needs to pretend that he's God? What does it feel like? And how do I feel about the 5-year-old that's doing everything possible to please him? It's negating my own needs, my own state in order to please him. Right? Someone so narcissistic that he doesn't even know that he's narcissistic, but needs a child, an infant, to give him the parenting he never received. Right? What does it feel like? And so I don't think most people in or out of the Lazaris community have gotten in touch with what that's like to be that infant, to be that child in our system, in our cult. Because my parents were average. Lazaris listeners, right? Hippies, seekers. My parents were average. They're not special in the cruelty or dissociation or abuse. They're the norm. And it was so painful that I bottled that away for decades. And it just doesn't get worked out in the Lazaris material, which is where I left the Lazaris material to do things that were more effective, but still didn't put me into the fullness of that pain. It took psychedelics and re-traumatization to actually grasp what I was dealing with. And so after 7 years of dealing with that, right, I'm beginning to get tired of that story, right? But Lazaris is talking to teenagers about getting tired to the story, about that story, because I was 12 years old when I encountered Lazaris. And so that's the first step, right? To actually have an ego story, and then to get over the ego story and develop the self story. That's the story of overcoming these issues, right? And Lazaris has been part of my story of overcoming, right? Figuring out how to write goals, leave home at age 17, right? How to start a business with $50 to my name. Those are part of the stories of triumph and overcoming, right? Here's how I did it. This is the techniques I used, this, et cetera, et cetera. And so I've had the self story in many ways more consciously than I've had the ego story because of the emphasis Lazaris has, on moving beyond into the more and not to the lesser and all that. There's this continual narrative of it lands as it's better, or, Lazaris says nothing is better, right? Why does it make you better then? Because you're more spiritual than other people. But then he'll talk about being more, right? You can be more spiritual, and you should be more spiritual. Well, that sounds better, right? So there's a lot of that type of dynamic. Having to re-triumph, right? So, as I'm making this video now, like 7 years after the sexual abuse, etc., I'm still carrying 40% of that in my body. But after 7 years, I've developed competence and confidence that I know how to carry 40% PTSD in my body and still survive and be secure and begin to develop love and belonging and self-esteem. So I know how to wake up feeling horrible and move to a place where I can get out of bed and move to a place where I can manage my business and move to a place where I can manage my relationship mostly, right? I've got enough competence and success over the last 7 years to know that I can do that. When this first hit me, I didn't know if I would die or not because it's completely unknown territory. And nobody around me seems to have a clue, right? Their behavior that makes it worse is telling me they don't know what they're doing. And I don't know what I'm doing. So am I going to survive in maximum incompetence? Meaning in a completely ignorant environment where neither I or anyone around me seems to know what they're doing in this terrain. Is survival or death going to be the consequence? I didn't know, which in and of itself is re-traumatizing, right? So I went back and really delved into the narrative. How was it that I could be buried 8 layers deep in unconsciousness? Who was down there? Who had been put underground? And then lied to, right? Who had buried me and what parts of me while pretending they were helping me? And then pretending that I wasn't screaming, like lying about the lies and then lying about those lies and lying. How did I get to be so far below the ground that neither I nor anyone else knew where I was buried? And how do you unpack 10 layers of lies, none of which the cult wants to deal with? I mean, my parents and family don't want to deal with this. Concept Synergy doesn't want to deal with this. My therapist piled the dirt on, right? They don't want to deal with it. My lovers don't have a clue. The cult at large, how you doing? Terrible? Well, don't tell me about it. Bye. You know, massive incompetence. So how am I going to work through that level of ignorance, that level of stupidity, that level of cruelty, that level of incompetence in a traumatized state? Am I going to die? Or am I going to grow? That was the question, right? And it was a mystery, right? Am I going to die or am I going to grow? Well, I decided I would record the entire thing. That's actually what leads to this video, right? Unable to get out of a bed in a Manila hotel, I put my phone on the pillow because it was too hard to lift my arms and began talking. 7 years ago, I began recording the narrative that I decided this is going to record the steps to my death, or it's going to record the steps to getting out of this hell. There will be a record, one way or another, that will be useful to other people. And that was the first step in my personal great work, right? Because after the ego story and the self story, I decided it would go together, right? That my self story, how I got out or died, would be turned into service. That I will document my ascent or my descent or both, my dead ends or my successes, until I died or got out. And I have thousands of hours of videos, thousands upon thousands of videos. And the videos have gotten better, right? This is a better video than barely being able to keep my eyes open with a cell phone, right? So there's an evolution of the technology of voice, the technology of ideas, the technology of lighting, the technology of sound, the technology of cameras, right? There's an evolution. And my personal great work to help other people, to give a voice to this terrain that so many people are in, that so many people don't know they're in, that almost no one knows how to articulate. I thought, well, here I am. I have articulating talent. I'm going to put this in to a record. And thanks to the technology of YouTube, etc., thousands of hours on understandtrauma.com. That's what I wanted to do, understand trauma. Something that had been a blind spot, something that a stranger in a cafe introduced me to. Believe it or not, one can do $140,000 of therapy with more than 40 practitioners and come out knowing nothing about trauma or PTSD. I did it. Great success. But it's not that hard in our cult, in our culture, to do lots of work and not understand trauma and PTSD. I went through all the Lazaris material without understanding trauma and PTSD. Congratulations to Lazaris. Congratulations, to our cult. We don't like looking at trauma and PTSD, and so we don't. And we're incompetent when other people enter the state. It's a biological state. It's not a psychological state. We don't even know that most of the time. So that's kind of moving into it's wonderful, right? I'm making more money than I've ever made before, despite only being able to work 4 hours a day. I've doubled my income and halved my hours, right? So that there's a narrative, how to do that. What were the steps, right? And that's documented. That's explored. And there's also a willingness to be skeptical. Like this channel is a response because adolescence is part of individuation. You've got to go through antipathy. You've got to rebel. You've got to reject. You've got to criticize in order to differentiate and to individuate. Well, all the focus on synergy and love and empathy and all that somewhat bypassed a lot of that for me in my teenage years. I was working with Lazaris. I wasn't criticizing Lazaris. I wasn't criticizing, some certain amount with my parents, etc. And so, moving into that is useful, right? The vast majority of Lazaris friends are not doing as well as they would like, mentally, emotionally, financially, physically, psychologically, right? It's not a good terrain for dealing with trauma. Many people are stuck, and they don't know why. And because Lazaris talks about their techniques working beautifully and how wonderful they are and what high resonance they are, there's a lot of shame in the Lazaris community. Because if Lazaris is so great, what's wrong with me that I don't get it, right? There's nothing wrong with you, right? You're at an evolutionary point. You're intersecting with an influence. You're intersecting with a technology that I find incredibly ineffective when it comes to trauma and PTSD. Unfortunately, until you deal with trauma and PTSD, the techniques that might be very effective post-trauma and post-PTSD don't have the same result, right? So if Lazaris is not very good at identifying trauma and PTSD and resolving it, and people are using techniques that don't work very well for traumatized people with PTSD, and Lazaris is talking about how great they are, we're the highest resonance that has ever touched the planet. Our techniques work. Lazaris is not doing surveys, right? This is a profound criticism and an invitation to concept synergy to step up to the plate. Do surveys. Don't pronounce that our technology works. Find out how well it works relative to other technologies. Because that's competent, right? Every drug company, though they cheat the stats, right? That we're in a sociopathic environment, so they cheat the stats, right? Let's hide the data that shows that our drug that we've just spent $500 million developing works and it doesn't work, and we'll publish the studies that show it works, and we'll just do enough studies, and we won't publish the studies that say it doesn't work or doesn't work better than the placebo, so that we can sell our drug, right? That's the game plan, right? That's all around us. Pharmaceutical companies distorting data to make more money, because that's what reptiles do. And reptilian brain systems breed for competency. You've got to get then smarter, right? You can't be dumb and deal with pharmaceuticals. You've got to outsmart the reptile so that they can't profit from your stupidity, because that's the only way reptiles learn, when they have no other option, right? So it's inviting you to grow up. It's inviting you to get smart, right? That's also the invitation with concept synergy. Our techniques work, this or that. No data. No statistical data. Not even up to the hoax of the pharmaceutical data. I've never gotten a survey from Concept Synergy. They do not want to know what works and doesn't work. They do know because they get the backstory. When Lazaris says this person doesn't have cancer and she goes to the cancer clinic and is covered in cancer, and they call Concept Synergy, hey, think Lazaris maybe doesn't know what they're talking about here? They get those stories. They just don't publish the stories. Right? Lazaris has not chosen a company that is any better than the pharmaceutical companies. That's just the state of our consciousness here, right? And it would be a joke to say that I know better, because I don't know what to do about it, right? Do you? Do you know how to get Concept Synergy to own up to their shadow? I don't. Do you know how to get pharmaceutical companies to publish all the studies, including the failure, including the areas their product does harm? If you know how to do it, why haven't you done it? Right? If the Lazaris techniques work, why haven't they worked there, right? So this is not I'm not in any way saying that I know what I'm doing here. But a step forward seems to be to acknowledge that we don't know what we're doing. Because if you know what you're doing and you haven't done better than this, I'd question that, right? I don't know what I'm doing better than this, right? I know how to get to here, but I don't know how to do much better than here, or I would be doing it, right? And neither do you, right? Let's get real. So, this is, and this may be bullshit, right? This may be the best bullshit. In fact, all language, let's get real, all language is a map of reality that is not as complex as the underlying reality it attempts to map. You can have an accurate map on Google Streets, but it doesn't tell you how many pine cones are in the tree to the left of you. It's not real. It's a map of reality. It's a simple map that doesn't include how many pine cones, nor does it include how depressed the people are in the house to the right. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny fragment of a representational truth of reality, and that's what words are. That's all words can ever be. A tiny, tiny representative fragment assembled out of the illusion of partition, right? You take reality and you divide it into language, up and down, left and right. These are nonsense. They're illusions. There is no up without down, so dividing it is an illusion, right? So this is just the best illusion that I can conjure. And it's better than the illusion that I could conjure a decade ago. I think so. It's more complex, it's more complete, more dimensional, more symmetrical. It's better than the map. Because that's all words are. They're maps for reality. They're symbols, crude symbols for a far more complex dynamic. So we can say with absolute certainty that every single thing that I say is wrong, even though it may lead in the right direction, which makes it right enough to be useful. We can say the same with Lazaris, right? Everything Lazaris says is incomplete, lacks complexity and nuance relative to the underlying reality. Does it take us in the right direction? And I think that is an open question at different times. To have stayed bottled up in the Lazaris loop would not have taken me as far as leaving the Lazaris loop, right? Because every dogma has its loop, right? God said that they wrote the Bible, and the Bible says that God wrote the Bible, right? So it's a nice little loop. So all you have to look at is this one little piece and don't look anywhere else, right? And the same holds true with almost every teacher, etc. Most people believe that their guru, their teacher, their friend, right? But you don't pay friends. Like, that's one of my criticisms with Lazaris. You don't pay friends. Have you ever had an interaction with Lazaris that you didn't pay them? Right? If I say, hey, be my friend, just pay me for all our interactions, well, it's one, you can do with that what you like, right? So it's useful to look critically, and so it's given me a certain amount of freedom and a certain amount of opportunity to evolve, to be critical of Lazaris, and certainly critical of concept synergy and of others in the Lazaris community, including myself, right? To be critical, right? To say, hey, you did that a lot. That's not working, but you did it a lot some more. That's dumb, right? That's useful, right? If you want to evolve to something better, that's a good starting point, right? We've done this a lot. It's gotten us this far, but it's not getting us much further. I'm doing it a lot again. That's dumb. So now we've got a repetitive loop with somebody too dumb to know what to do with it, right? That's a start, right? Now we know what the problem is, right? I'm on a loop and I'm too dumb to get off the loop. Okay, so let's learn some more. Let's go out. Are there other loops, right? Because there's lots of loops, right? Science has its loop. The only thing real is science, except you learn that René Descartes was inspired to develop science from an angel, right? It takes you out of the loop, doesn't it, right? Cartesian, materialistic, rationalist, reductionist science was inspired by a dream, by a vision of an angel. Takes you out of the loop, doesn't it, right? Penny, Lazaris' closest friend, dies of morbid obesity, failing chronically to even successfully sell certain of Lazaris' material, and then her partner commits suicide the next day. The closest people to the most rational, the most effective technique practitioner, the highest resonance, right? Takes you out of the loop. It wakes you up a little bit, right? Wait a minute. We can't just rack up credit card debts going to Lazaris workshops indefinitely and it'll all work out, right? The closest person to Lazaris did not have one of those beautiful deaths Lazaris talked about where you get to a nice old age and you just decide to leave your body because that's what you decide to do. Proximity doesn't guarantee success. Not even statistically suggest it, right? When you realize that concept synergy employees are in abuse dynamics with themselves, with Jach, with Penny, it doesn't, no. 1%, 2% figure out how to work with the material effectively, according to Lazaris, and Penny wasn't part of that 1 or 2%, perhaps. Or, I don't know what I'm talking about, right? Could very well be, right? They're just words. They're just words. Do they, right? What do they do? What's the impact, right, of those words? And, it's interesting because one of the beauties of getting words out there, like a lot of this talk has emerged, has flown out of a certain state. The last little bit about Penny, I saw some envy there, right? I haven't seen that envy in much of the rest of it, but it's like, oh. I get what I'm saying, I get what I'm trying to say, but I notice some envy there, right? So what's that about, right? And obviously, having worked with the jealousy and envy and rage tape, let's just assume that that's correct, that 30% of what I said in the last 5 minutes was coming out of envy. Let's just assume that, since could be, right? I see some envy there. There's a picture there that has a bit of that tone, right, in the back of my mind. Well, that means that I don't know how to clear that envy. It means I also don't fully understand it, because when the words were about to come out of my mouth, I didn't see the envy. But as I was talking about it, I kind of saw it off on the side. So that means I don't know how to see it ahead of time. I know how to see it reactively or after the fact. Well, that's not as good as seeing it ahead of time and not saying it, right? Or talking about the envy. What am I envious about? Am I envious about Lazaris not talking to me the way that Lazaris talked to Penny? Perhaps. Right? Is that it? Am I envious about feeling unloved and off on the sidelines? And some people being out in the forefront? That feels a little closer to it, right? Being off on the sidelines. I'm always afraid of overstimulation as a sensitive person, as someone dealing with trauma. Lots of little biological things can set me off. So I'm often in the corner. I'm often in the back because I don't want to deal with the anxiety of overstimulation, right? So, but perhaps there's a part of me that's really sad about not ever stepping more into the spotlight. Right? And Penny had guts, right? She jumped in there, right? So that could be the envy, right? It's hard to say, right? But I think that's probably it. You know, there's a part of me doesn't want to acknowledge my talent and ability. It feels right. You know, I have to say it and then evaluate it, right? And one of the crises in our world, in my experience, is there's no one to say it to. I'm talking to a camera because I don't have anyone with the tracking ability in my life to say this to them. All right? I don't have a relationship with anyone that, you know, and that's one of the alienating aspects of a Lazaris relationship is 99% of the world's population has never heard of Lazaris, is never going to hear of Lazaris, and doesn't have enough intimacy to actually know what I'm talking about. I'm talking to myself, to a camera, right? Because in my reality, I'm the only one that knows what I'm talking about. And if I can't see certain things without talking about them, like if I couldn't have had that meta loop there, because that was one of the first times that I learned something in this whole thing. I learned that I was jealous or envious, and I didn't know it. That's why I need to talk. Right? But I don't know anyone in the Lazaris community that I could free roll like this. And this would be banned in the forum. Like this is concept synergy's control. This could not be posted in the forum, which is the reason it needs to exist without it, right? Fear and control, you know, domination, blockades, people banned from the forum. That's not the Lazaris material. That's the 98% of people that don't get the Lazaris material, including concept synergy, right? And let's just throw me in there, right? Most of the time. So, you know, that's how this emerges, is to become aware of something and to detect the flaws in what I'm saying, of which they're all flaws, but the bigger flaws, the flaws that are worth looking at. We need a model of reality that isn't real. Words are not real. The model of reality is not reality. Thoughts are a model of reality based on language, which is a model of reality, right? The word hand is not this, and it's not complete. And it pretends that hand is separate from something else, which it isn't. So we need a model so that we can improve the model, even though the model and the improvements are both lies, right? For human consciousness, we need a model, right? And I don't know exactly what's going on in this area of the model, right? I don't know exactly what's going on in this area of the model. There's some muddiness, right? Again, in my criticism of concept synergy, there's a bit of muddiness. And I don't know what that's about, right? But I wouldn't know what that's about either without talking more about it, right? And this is not the kind of thing, I can't hold my attention to write this long. My hands would get tired, my mind would get distracted. Talking holds my attention enough to go into the subtleties at which area the model of reality that isn't real, that isn't reality, but that is my version of reality, can be evolved. And so my personal my personal great work is about, for example, educating people about trauma, is synthesizing parts of what has worked beautifully with the Lazaris material. Like, I was listening to the great work thing and I was like, yeah, I get it. I get it. But I get it now, right? After a close to 20-year break with the material. I get bits of this. But it's important to have a differentiated and independent model and see what I do and don't understand. Because, one of the areas that I notice as I listen to Lazaris now at age 47 rather than at age 15, Lazaris emphasizes, right? Lazaris emphasizes it can all happen with joy, it can all happen with fun, it doesn't have to happen with pain. You don't have to fail and have despair, you could just have fun and love and success, and it's easier to succeed than it is to fail and all that. And what that seems to do, as I experience it, is cheapen, is dismiss the struggle, the pain, etc. Right? Lazaris says in the great work that most people doing the great work, and this would hold true with Eckhart Tolle and Byron Katie, come to it through the depths of despair, pain, and an agony that's too big to deal with. And they make a decision in that pain and in that despair to do great work. Well, that's certainly my experience, right? I didn't really understand the pain that so many people are in until I was sexually abused by my therapist and then punished for telling people about it, and then surrounded by incompetence. And I looked at that and I said, first of all, the sexual abuse that I've experienced is very small compared to any number of horrific stories I've heard about. So I thought, okay. I thought my sexual abuser is not particularly blind, right? Obviously, I was too blind to pick him, and he was too blind to do the various dumb things that he did, but that means we're both dumb. But that also means that the cult that raised me is dumb, right? All my work with Lazaris, all my work with other therapists, all my work with crystals, all that, none of that allowed me to see stupidity staring me in the face, which means that I'm pretty dumb, right? So, but that also means that I'm surrounded by pretty dumb things that don't know how to teach me not to be dumb, right? Right? Stupid people don't come out of vastly intelligent ecologies. Particularly a majority of stupid people don't come out of vastly intelligent ecologies. They come out of stupid ecologies that brainwash and program people to be stupid, right? So it's not particularly surprising or important that I am stupid, right? I couldn't pick a better therapist. I couldn't do this. I couldn't do that. I don't know what's wrong. My ignorance and stupidity is all around me, right? If anything, I'm less stupid than average in some areas, right? But perhaps more stupid than average in some areas, or maybe about average, and that I think I'm less stupid than average, right? There may not be any difference, right? So, but what do you do when you realize that you're stupid? And you realize the people around you taught you to be stupid? What do you do then? You don't confidently go forward. I'm a very stupid person, surrounded by stupid people. It's not a logical leap to go say, okay, I know what to do. No, you don't. You've just shown you don't know what to do, right? So where do I turn to know what to do, right? Well, I'm obviously too dumb to figure that out, right? I haven't figured it out so far. I've turned to this person and this person and this person and this person, which means that I don't know the person to turn to or the way to turn to them, right? So doing more of that isn't necessarily a way forward. That was the hardest thing to deal with, frankly. The obvious truth was that I didn't know what I was doing, which meant, since I couldn't find someone else who knew what they were doing, that nobody knew what they were doing, but the pain was getting bigger and bigger. But who do you turn to? Right? Who do you turn to? You know, so that's the crisis. That's the crisis. And I think that crisis is going to hit more of us harder in the next 20 years. Right? I think it's inevitable. Or it's probable, right? Highly probable. The way things are going, I think it will become clearer to more of us that we don't know what we're doing and don't understand that well enough to know what the next step is, to know what to do. Because that was the paralysis for me. I went along with all the things that caused all this pain. Obviously, I thought it was a good move, which means that I don't know what a good move is, right? Because I repeatedly failed, and I'm still failing, right? So, you know, that's the piece that I'm working with. I have gotten clear. For example, I didn't think money was particularly important. It seemed incredibly dumb watching my clients stress themselves and ruin their marriages to make money. It just seemed really dumb, right? And so I thought, you know, I'm never going to put money as a very important thing, but I didn't have as much of a nest egg so I had then the trauma of not knowing my survival when I was hit with this other trauma, right? So I realized, no, I have underestimated the usefulness of a nest egg, right? And so things like that I've figured out, right? And so now I have a, 10 times bigger nest egg than I did then. And figuring out how to do that in a traumatized state is also useful, right? So that's, and, when there's unimaginable levels of pain that are too painful to feel, I also learned that helping other people was useful, right? I couldn't feel pleasure and well-being very much directly, but I could see it in the faces of people I touched, right? When I helped this person overcome their despair here, when I did this over here, I'd see their face light up. And I'd say, okay, well, that's worth living for, right? Because, in the question of life and death, should I commit suicide? That seemed very rational to me. I'm in way more pain than well-being. I don't know what I'm doing. The people around me don't know what they're doing. And I've been in way more pain and fear for most of my life than well-being. I have been terrified, lonely, and in pain most of my life. And I'm in more pain, and I'm more lonely, and I'm more terrified now, and I don't know what I'm doing. It's a terrifying realization. to realize the people around me don't necessarily know what they're doing either, right? They certainly don't know enough to help me with this. And so, I turned to the woman who's now my wife, but at the time, this was the woman who was in the most crisis, right? No attraction. It just seemed like I could be useful to another human being. And so I realized that her problems were very different than mine, but she was in a similarly traumatized state. So I just focused on her and watching her grow thousands and thousands of %. And she became my teacher, right? Because it was working, right? She was lifting off faster than anyone I'd seen, right? Just taking off. And I thought, this is so beautiful to watch the human spirit seize an opportunity and go with it. And I thought, that's worth living for, right? To be of service. And maybe that's what people in my state need to do. Help someone. It worked, right? I would watch her growing, and then I would have some confidence that maybe doing more of what she was doing was a good step, right? Because that broke through the paralysis of the awareness that I don't know what I'm doing, or I wouldn't have done this, right? And so, I'm very interested. I've formed a nonprofit. I've been donating, which is very interesting as well, because as I say, I've never been that interested in earning money to make money. Very skeptical of a lot of the wealthier people that I do work with. They're not enjoying life as much as I was, traveling and stuff like that. And so until I formed the nonprofit, I did, and I'm also not, very impressed with the U.S. government and what it's spending money on. So making more money to pay more taxes for no particular reason, I was plateauing, right? And so when I formed a nonprofit and began to respond to these things, thinking like, going back to that analysis, I've been broken in many ways. My identity has shattered through the combination of cultural blind spots, individual blind spots, therapeutic incompetence, my own incompetence, both picking the therapist and going along with this and then responding to the abuse, all incompetently, right? Because nobody had ever given me a lesson. If you are sexually abused by your therapist, here's what you should do and here's what you should not do. Never came up, right? Like 99% of the important things out there, they just don't seem to come up. In the educational system, in the parenting system, in the work system. Systemic stupidity, systemic blindness. So, I realized what other people are dealing with. And I realized they had less of a clue than I did, and less resources than I did, and less resources, right? How many people can spend 1,000 hours studying trauma and PTSD while barely being able to work? Less than 5% of the global population has enough resources to do that. But many of them are more traumatized than I am, have fewer prospects than I do, are being reshamed and re-traumatized today with no window out. Well, if I'm to be a human being rather than just a reptile, the human brain responds to that with empathy. With enough empathy to want to help, not just to pity or judge, or, to help, to do something about that. And so, having helped the two people closest to me, one is an amazing employee who's now, I think he's 30 years old now, and after working for, with me for 10 years, he's set, right? He's got, he's grown thousands and thousands of % in his life skills. He'll be able to retire by age 35 with no debt, 2 houses, investment properties. He learned that from me. And he's much happier, and his marriage is happier, and his kid is healthier. It's wonderful, right? So I'm incredibly honored to have worked with someone of his caliber. So that's on the employee front. My other employees fight learning tooth and nail. They don't want to learn anything, right? So it's, so sustained willful poverty. It's maddening. But anyway, at least one. Beautiful. And my wife, traumatized, shame-based, thousands of % in life skill, happier than I am, helped her siblings out of the abuse dynamics of her family, having gotten herself out first. Beautiful, right? So that's kind of personal, and then the website and doing work with some of this, helping with that. Now beginning, right? Because I'm the one who is so dumb I don't know what I don't know, right? So beginning to learn, how to sculpt a nonprofit, how to sculpt a future worth living. Being of service to other people in this similar terrain. Understanding, because I understood in the middle of all this, I understood that one competent human being could have saved 7 years of pain and miserable abuse, right? I was abusing myself. I was abused. I was surrounded by incompetence. One competent human being, it could have been me, right? I wasn't competent, but a single competent human being could have transformed that moment into excellence, right? And I could not find a single competent human being capable and willing to do it anywhere on the planet, which of course speaks to my incompetence, but it also speaks to the planet. The resources that I was looking for that I knew would work, I couldn't find them. And it wasn't a matter of money. I spent $70,000, rapidly managing pain and doing various things. It wasn't a matter of money. It was a matter of blindness. It was a matter of training. It was a matter of how cold, how reptilian. I mean, even the therapeutic protocols of charging a client $300 an hour, and you have to go to their office whether or not you can drive, and do their protocol whether or not it works, or they won't work with you, is cold, is profoundly sociopathic. You've been hurt more than anyone else, we'll charge you more than anyone else, and if it doesn't work, tough, right? That's not the kind of love that massive amounts of trauma needs. I couldn't find that love. Right? I found enough, obviously, right? Because here I am, right? And that's the childhood story. but it can be developed 20 times better, right? And so that's what I began developing, was a model during all of this. How could I be growing 20 times faster while consuming less energy and do it with more confidence and certainty than what I'm experiencing? And I developed a model. It's called 10x Living. If you look at 10xliving.org, look at the dimensions area, how to have 1,000% higher quality of life while consuming less natural resources and money. Obviously, time stays the same, but less time per unit of well-being. To get more well-being per unit of time. To get more well-being substantially per unit of money. You know, that is an exciting journey. That's worth living for, right? And so I've tripled my income to make money for my nonprofit. And in the process had to grow, right? Because now I have a reason to create a 10x model of life, right? And that's where my personal great work of touching a few people and coming out of this journey has the probability. I don't know the statistics because I've never done it before, right? But let's say it has a 10% probability of becoming part of a great work, right? Something that could self-replicate, something that could touch a wider section of people. Well, that's worth going for, a 10% probability of that. That's worth going for. Nobody has any guarantees in this stuff. And so I have found my personal great work and a possibility, a probability of moving towards work that touches a people, maybe 500, maybe 1,000 people in different ways. And I'm interested in expanding that probability. And I do find what Lazaris is saying relevant and useful in this terrain. It was an insightful, I'd say I got a lot more out of it now than I did, in my 20s. And so here we are.